Today we are going to play with embossing powders, no matter if you are a collector and have loads in your stash or you only have a few jars. I'll learn you some awesome hacks and I will give you lots of tips along the way. You don't want to miss this, so let's get to it. Let's start with the basic supplies. A heat tool, a box, an old towel, a coffee filter, embossing ink, embossing powder and some more colors, and a pointy tool. And that's enough to get started. Let's first start with some ink and embossing powder. I've cut this cogwheel out of cardboard and I'm going to ink it up to make sure that my fingers don't get sticky. I'm going to press it in the ink with a piece of paper. And this way my fingers stay clean. And the embossing powder won't stick on my fingers. So I'm inking up the complete cogwheel. And this makes for a sticky cogwheel and clean fingers. Next I have the coffee filter. The coffee filter is less static than regular paper and that's why I like to use it. And I will show you that. First I'm going to add some embossing powder. And then with the pointy tool I'm going to pick it up. I tap on the pointy tool and I can simply take off my cogwheel. And I put it in the box on the towel. Next I'm going to make sort of a funnel out of my coffee filter by folding it. And this way I can easily pour the embossing powder back in the jar. I tap on it a few times. And this way I get a clean coffee filter, all ready to use again. Next, preheating the heat tool. I set it on 2 and then I make sure it's pointing at nothing, so nothing is in front of it. And this is very important because you don't want to melt anything while you are preparing for your project. And preheating will help you melt your powder faster, which is very handy for a bunch of reasons. When you have embossing powder with the bigger chunks, you want to make sure they melt really fast. And a preheated heat tool will help do that. The next thing that will help melt those chunks as well is to swirl heat. So make a turning motion with your heat tool while you are melting. This sort of pre-melts the pieces, sticking them together, making sure they don't fly away. And this way you can heat your piece from the top without having to hold it. And it also works with a thicker paper like this chipboard. And this way you will get all those yummy colors from the embossing powder on your project as well. And here you can see it again, the light color difference when the powder is sticking together. And then you can see the complete transformation when the color changes and the powder is melted into a gorgeous colorful layer. Next, the embossing wand. This is a tool you can make yourself. It's a piece of cardboard with sticky notes on top, sticky side up. And this is a great tool to help you with embossing smaller pieces without burning your fingers. I have a video on how you can make it and I will link to that in the description box below. I'm going to add the smaller pieces and I press them down on the sticky part. And once they are on the embossing wand, I can press them in the ink. Just press each piece in the ink so they are inked up well. And then I'm going to add my embossing powder on top. Just sprinkle it on with my coffee filter underneath or a piece of paper if you prefer that. Then just tap on the wand to remove the excess powder. And then I'm going to hold it over the box to melt it, to catch any powder that will fall off, making your desk less messy. And then I'm going to melt the powder. And then I can just take off the pieces. I remove the paper, revealing the next clean sticky paper, and then my embossing wand is ready for another project. I add a piece of non-sticky paper on top, so the sticky part stays clean, and then I can put it away. And now another fun technique, ink on your embossing powder. So I have a used dry baby wipe that I folded, and I'm going to pick up some ink. I'm using VersaFine Clair, and this will work with VersaFine Clair as well as with pigment inks. So I'm just dabbing on a bit of that ink, making sort of a fun pattern. A bit of really simple, fun mixed media. And then I put the cogwheel on a heat resistant mat and I'm going to melt the complete piece. And you see the color change a little bit, it gets a little bit lighter and now you can touch it and it won't rub off anymore. And because the ink is melted in and blended a bit, it gives a bit more of a softer look with the transition of the color of the ink to the embossing powder. So this is another cool technique that you can use. And here you can see with the pigment ink that it works as well. And this technique works best when you have a big color difference between the embossing powder and the ink. So a light color and a dark color combined. And after melting you see the colors have blended a bit and you get this really cool grungy look. And what's better than 10 embossing hacks? even more embossing hacks of course. And that's why I've teamed up with the lovely Rebecca Keppel. She's all fired up to show you more super cool hacks for you to try. And I will point you in the right direction at the end of the video. On with the next technique, also a bit of a mixed media style technique. I've inked up a heart shape cut out of chipboard and I'm adding some big grain clear embossing powder and I'm going to melt that. And I'm going to repeat the steps for 2 layers and this gives me a nice glossy base. Next I'm going to ink up my heart again and then add a layer of colored embossing powder that I also melted. I have a heat resistant mat on my desk with a coffee filter on top and I'm heating up that heart again. And once the embossing powder is moving a little bit, I'm going to add some embossing powder and I use a little spoon for that. I pick up the heart and I turn it over in one move, so the embossing powder falls off and doesn't slide off. And then I'm going to melt that layer. And you can see that embossing powder is already moving a bit. And while this layer is still hot, I'm going to add another color. Again, with a spoon sprinkling it on. I melt it again so the powder sticks to the previous layer and then I'm going to add another color embossing powder while it's still hot. And then I'm going to melt it again. And you can see those layers moving really well already. Then I pick the pointy tool and I'm going to help spread that color around a little bit. This way you can make the layers that are at the bottom come back a bit on top again. And then once you're done, leave it to cool, that won't take long. And there you go, a really pretty marbled heart. And this is one done in the same way. Add a layer of clear embossing powder on top for some more depth in the design. And this is the card that I made with that pretty heart and the mechanical shapes. And when you're having lots of fun inking and embossing, your pad can get a little bit dry. You can use a re-inker, spread some ink on the sponge surface, and then use something flat like an old gift card to spread your ink. Move it in all directions to work it in your ink pad. And there you go, ready to go for the next round. And the next one is another one of my favorites and it's super simple. I have a flower with 1 layer embossed. I'm inking up that flower only in the middle. Then I'm adding embossing powder and I turn it over in one take to shake off the excess. And then I'm going to take my pointy tool and scribble along those lines, along the outside edges where the powder is, to get rid of those harsh lines. And this will give you a really pretty blended look. And I should have picked some colors that were easier to see, but you will see it when I'm melting. Here you can see it blends beautifully and it gives you a little bit of cool texture as well. And here I added that flower with more layers as a focal point on my card. You can also do this with more colors, like 1 layer first and then just add 1 layer and melt that and then add the next layer. If you want to get rid of those harsh lines, you can use your finger as well and then melt it again. And this is another super cool option. Now for all techniques goes, do what works for you. Not everything is for everyone, so use what suits you best. It's that simple. For this technique I have a piece of double-sided adhesive on a complete card. I add that on my coffee filter and then I'm going to add the first color embossing powder. And I only add that at about 1/3 of the card. And then I let it slide off in the direction where the powder is. Then I turn it around and I tap on the card and instead of that harsh line, you will get a softer, more blended look. And I'm going to do the same with 2 more colors. Now this technique you may have seen in one of my glitter videos, but it's such a cool technique with stunning results and it works perfect with embossing powders as well. And once you have added all the colors, you can melt it with the heat tool and then this is the result. A gorgeous ombre background. And you can do the same with only 2 colors of course. You can add it on one side or a bit at the top and a bit at the bottom. And then the next color in the middle. And then melt it. And then instead of inking up and embossing an intricate piece, you can also use your embossed panel with die cuts. And this works perfectly with embossed panels with only 1 layer. Just run it through your machine. And this is also a great technique for intricate sentiments. It's way less fussy than inking it up. And that will make a great tool for both the positive and negative for you to use. And these are 2 cards made with the positive and negative. And next, embossing with stencils. I have Distress Micro Glaze. I'm adding some tape to the back of the stencil and the card to make sure it stays in place. And then I'm going to apply my micro glaze with a sponge applicator. I do that in a turning motion, applying it all over the card. And if you want to really clean a design, then make sure that you use enough of the micro glaze. I'm going for a little bit of a grungy look, so I don't need my micro glaze everywhere. And this is how your sponge looks after you applied it. It looks crappy, but it will pop up again. As you can see, it's still lying there and it goes back in shape really fast. This time I'm using embossing glaze, which is translucent, and that will give you lots of fun options. I'm just shaking that over the card and then I tap off the excess, and then I'm going to melt my embossing powder. Why I use a towel. It keeps smaller pieces in place when melting the powder. It catches pieces that may fly around, which always happens with embossing powder. It prevents paper from warping without having to heat it from both sides, which I find way too fussy. And now we have that clear why I use the towel. I'm going to add another layer of the micro glaze. I turn the stencil so I get the pattern sideways, and then I'm applying my micro glaze in the same way with a turning motion. Then I'm adding my embossing powder and I'm going to shake it on the card and then shake off the excess again. And because the micro glaze is translucent, you get that cool layering look. And this is how it looks after melting. You get that gorgeous layering look, which gives you lots of cool options. And then next, this is one of the best finds ever, I think. But you have to make sure you're prepared. So I have my vellum ready, I have my embossing powder, the heat tool is on, and I have a towel underneath my coffee filter, which I didn't show. But you need that towel as well. So printed a sentiment on my vellum, and then I'm going to add some embossing powder. And when you add your embossing powder and you have a little smudge like that, you can use a soft brush to brush it away. Works perfectly on a regular paper as well. And then I'm going to swirl heat again. And the reason I'm using the towel like this all flat and my paper all flat on top is because the heat is going through and through. And it makes that the vellum doesn't warp. Goes for a regular paper as well. And because I didn't have a box this size, I thought this is a really good option as well. So I'm just swirling with my heat tool. This takes a bit because you have to be careful. You don't want to warp your vellum. Once warped, it doesn't unwarp or something. So I'm just swirling with the heat tool, and you can already see that that powder is melting, and it gives such a fancy and delicate look that I think it's super cool. And this will give you lots of options. And this is how it looks after melting. I think it looks really cool. And you can do that with another color as well, of course. So I've printed another one and I've added some silver embossing powder. And I'm also melting that, and that gives a really cool look as well. I think this is pretty posh, isn't it? So what you can do is add it inside the card like I did for one of my fancy cards from last week's video. And these are the printed sentiments on my vellum. I think it looks pretty awesome. Phew, that was a lot, and you made it all through here. Now hop on over to learn more hacks at Rebecca's channel. I have a link right here for you, so hop on over to say hi, and of course, make sure to keep on crafting.